will read for Amos Salamon from the Geological Survey of Israel, which unfortunately cannot be here today. I'll do my best. So the title is Tremble, Thou Earth, How Can These Exodus Marvels Be? Reading through Psalm 114 as well as the Passover Haggadah, we read through very awe-inspiring natural occurrences. We read that the seas were fleeing, rivers are reversing, and mountains are skipping. These events bear a very strong resemblance to environmental effects now recognized by modern seismologists as characteristics of large magnitude earthquake. Now, in this presentation, we're going to explore together how these biblical descriptions through the lens of classical seismology and earthquake-induced landscape responses. So the outline for this talk will consist of the seismology now and then. We're also going to give a rough timeline for these occurrences. Then we're going to read through the sentences in Psalm 114 and try to define the earthquake parameters. Then we're also going to talk about the assumed earthquake secondary effects, which are also discussed in mentioned in Psalm 114, and then we're going to summarize and try to talk about our understandings. What you see before you is the origin of interest. You can see that it's highlighted here by this green square, and this is found within a broader context of plate tectonics. The Eastern Mediterranean is a zone of active deformation at the junction of Africa, Arabian, and Euro-Asian plate. The Dead Sea Transform is the main seismic feature that is responsible for the tectonic activity that takes place in Israel. The Levant's long record of historical earthquakes provide a plausible tectonic backdrop for the geophysical interpretations that we can read in Psalm 114. Modern seismologist is a discipline that is grounded in empirical measurements. It is used for quantifying seismic shaking, for defining earthquake magnitudes, as well as assessing the impact of these natural phenomena. Past societies did not have the proper tools, nor did they have the actual understanding of these geological phenomena. So they relied mostly on their felt emotions, their fear, and their capability to describe what they're seeing. Sometimes these earthquakes and other phenomena were framed as a divine act, interpreted through a theological or even supernatural lenses. Now, to illustrate the difference, we can consider the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco as an example. The instrumental records tell us that this specific earthquake had a magnitude of 7.9. We can use the measurements, the actual modern measurements, to assess the rupture length, the fault motion, as well as the energy that is released. However, without such tools, the ancient witnesses, like those who composed Psalm 114, only perceived overwhelming physical and emotional disarray, shaking of the earth, retreating waters, and the distributed and disrupted landscape. To bridge the modern and the ancient understanding, we can employ the modified Morricelli intensity scale that you see here before you. This system ranks earthquakes' effect on how people react, how buildings perform, and how the natural environment responded to these geological catastrophes. This qualitative approach allows us to associate ancient textual descriptions with a modern seismic occurrence, even without having the actual instrumental data. Now, the ancient witnesses described not only geological effects, like you see here, like the ground that is rupturing, slope failures, and liquefaction process, as well as secondary effects of loud noises, thunders, fires, darkness, and chaos. But they often reflected these environmental processes through a theological lens. So what we're going to try to do is to recognize the overlap between the mythic language that we can read in Psalm 114 and the natural observation by reinterpreting the ancient text with the geoscientific paradigm. But first things first, we first need to understand what is the time frame that we are talking about. In other words, when did the earthquake occur, or when did the Israelites leave Egypt? So basically, we have two Exodus timeline theories. The early date theory, which takes place around the 15th century BCE, and this is based on the biblical chronology found in the first book of Kings, which places the Exodus about 480 years before Solomon's temple construction, sometimes around 1446 BCE. This is also supported by the Jewish Roman historian Josephus Flavius, and also aligns well with the archaeological destruction layers of some Canaanite sites like Jericho and others. There's another theory regarding the Israelite Exodus timeline, and this is called the late date theory, which takes place around the 13th century BCE. This interpretation is based on the construction of the Egyptian city Pitom Ramses, which you see here, as well as the name of the pharaoh, which is Ramses II, which is also mentioned in Exodus. If you consider the name of the city and the name of the pharaoh, we can suggest that this time the Exodus occurred around 1270 BCE. And this is further supported by the Merentef stele, which is also known as the Israel stele, which is dated to 1207 BCE, which indicates that there are a group of people which are identified as Israel, which already were established in the central hill country of the Holy Land. And this means that the Exodus has occurred sometime before this date. Okay, now we're going to read through several sentences in Psalm 114, and we'll try to interpret them the best that we can and also find some modern analogs that could further indicate what we're trying to identify. So the first sentence that I want us to read is sentence 7. Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of God of Jacob. We can interpret this specific sentence as the earthquake. By using seismic records of this area since the antiquity, it shows us that there's seismic activity taking place in various locations around the Levant, spanning the last 2,000 years. That means that this region is persistent with tectonic instability, and it aligns well with the biblical description that might reflect a real seismic phenomena. Okay, now I want us to read the second sentence. Judah was his sanctuary and Israel his dominion. This specific sentence can be identified as the affected area after the earthquake. In other words, the epicenter. Referring back to a combination of historical and modern earthquake assemblages covering the last 2,000 years, we can pinpoint the locations of a variety of earthquakes that took place in this area. What's common with all of these earthquakes is that they occurred adjacent to the Dead Sea transform. Using the earthquake of 1546 as an example enables us to get a sense of how such a seismic event was perceived in the eyes of past societies. This specific event is considered the strongest event that was documented in Israel. And you can see here that it occurred close to Jerusalem and has impacted the Holy Crypt located in the Christian quarter of the Old City. What you see here is the partly destroyed bell tower of this crypt, which is yet to be repaired to this day. In this map, you can see, which is produced in Ambarisian cuts, solid circles that show the location of the reported locations which were impacted by the earthquake that occurred in 1546. By using the records by Ambarisian carts, we can then pinpoint to the epicenter of this strong earthquake. And what we can say is that the damage was localized with a limited structural impact across a broader region. Based on their analysis, they believe that although this was traditionally believed to be an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.0, these authors believe that it was likely a moderate event with a magnitude of 6.0. And contrary to other reports, they believe that this specific event has been over-exaggerated, possibly influenced by the religious and cultural importance of the affected area. Now I want to show you another publication by Zohar et al., which present the extent and the damage of 31 historical earthquakes that occurred in Israel and in the southern parts of Lebanon. What you see here, based on Zohar et al. Analysis, it is that the northern parts of Israel from the Galil and up until Lebanon, this area was mostly affected by the strongest earthquake with the most amount of damage. The central part of Israel was affected by the highest, the most amount of earthquake over these 2,000-year period, while the southern part was least affected and also had the least amount of earthquake. Now I want us to look at the second part of the third sentence, which reads, Jordan was driven back. We can interpret this specific sentence as a landslide. The passage, which is presented by the publication by Ambarisi et al., taken from a letter written by an anonymous Italian writer, probably living on the coast, reads, on the day of the earthquake, the river Jordan dried up for 2 days, and so did all the streams around Jaffa that fell into the sea. And when they began to flow again, the water was red. We can interpret this specific sentence as a phenomena that follows after an earthquake, damming of a river. And we actually have a modern analog for that. After the strong earthquake that occurred in 1927, a very similar process occurred. The Jordan River bank was dammed, and a result of that, the Jordan River dried up for 2 days. And after 2 days, the river started to flow again, and the water transported sediments, red sediments, as well as organic material, which could explain this last sentence, why the water were red. I want us to now refer to the first part of the sentence. The sea saw it and fled. This specific sentence can be interpreted as a tsunami. Let's go back to the article by Ambarisi and Karts and read another passage from it. This is based on another writer that describes that the sea near Jaffa retreated to a distance of a full day's walk offshore, so that one could walk with dry feet on the seabed. A great many people, about 10,000, who ventured on the foot offshore were drowned when the sea came back. This sounds very much like a tsunami. Just before it hits the coast, it sucks the water offshore. The shoreline retreats back, and then when it hits, it basically drowns anyone in its path. And we have a modern analog for a tsunami that hit the Jaffa port following a strong earthquake that hit the Aegean Sea in 1956 with a magnitude of 7.5. And what you see here is the resulting tsunami that wasn't very high. We only had a wave of 25 centimeters, but this again shows the possibility of a tsunami that is generated by a strong earthquake. Now I want to refer to the fourth sentence. The mountains skipped like rams and the little hills like lambs. We can interpret this specific sentence as topographic amplification. Topographic amplification is the phenomena in which seismic waves are focused and amplified by the shape of the land, particularly in topographies that are higher. Zelensky and Shapira measured and assessed a specific earthquake in different areas with different elevations. And what they found is that the horizontal component amplified in relation to the vertical scale. And we have an example for this specific phenomena. What you see here is the destruction of a building that collapsed after the strong earthquake of 1927. This specific building was built in the Mount of Olives, and after the earthquake, it collapsed and killed about 3 of its residents when it collapsed. And now let us refer to the last sentence in Problem 114, which reads, which turned the rock into standing water, the flint into fountains of water. We can interpret this specific sentence as the hydrological effects that occur after an earthquake. So a seismic shaking can induce groundwater discharge by rupturing the confined layers or altering pressure gradients. Barisi and Katz quote another anonymous writer from 1546, which reads, on the same day blood was flowing out of the fountain, named after the prophet Eliseo, from which always water was drawn off. And at the beginning of this, flames coming out from the fountain were seen, and this lasted for 4 days. We can use the modern analog of an earthquake that occurred near Nueva in 1995 as our modern analog. This specific earthquake was fairly strong with a magnitude of 7.5, and it impacted the Moa Springs, which are found in the Aravad Desert. This slide here presents a schematic cross-section near the Moa Springs where the groundwater ascends along the interface between the Mishas Formation and the Grab unit. Following the 1995 Nueva earthquake, previously dry archaeological pools began to get overflooded by water that resulted from the Moa Spring after this earthquake. So this hydrological response to seismic activity offers a pretty good compiling geological framework for their interpreting biological motif of the rock turned into water, as described in Problem 114. And this is through the lens of classical seismology and earthquake-triggered subsurface fluid mobilization. So what did we understand from this presentation? First off, that the geography and possible landscape direct us to the Holy Land rather than Egypt, because there's no typical northern Egypt geography and landscape which are given in Problem 114. We can also say that a signal earthquake with a magnitude of 6.5 along the lower Jordanian Valley is capable of generating the natural effects which are described in Problem 114. And these consist of a tsunami, a landslide, hydrological effects. And in our view, and considering the lack of understanding at the time of how earthquakes are generated, these natural effects are taken or borrowed to empower the supernatural force known as the time as God. I want to use this opportunity to thank you all for your attention, and of course, thank the donors and organizers for this, I think, marvelous conference. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. I'm not going to put them all on you, but I'd like to just kick it off by asking the biblical scholars in the room. I see Thomas there, and I think there's a few more out there. What do we know about the dating of Psalm 114? When does it date to? Can you, if anybody wants to answer that, please go to a microphone. Well, somebody has to answer it, okay? And they have to go to the microphone if you're a card-carrying biblical scholar. No pressure. Okay, Thomas.
Tom, I'm still an Egyptologist by training, so I will defer to my colleague Philia from UBC for the dating question. But I wanted to just make a comment on this and other papers. How can we be certain that we don't read things into the ancient texts that are not actually there? Like the psalm seems to consist of a nice categorization of it's Israel and Judah, it's the sea and the river, it's the mountains and the hills, right? This seems to be very generic in nature, right? And it makes, of course, a statement about something that has impressed the people. But we should be careful maybe to read things from modern science into ancient texts that might not actually have been there. And now I hand over to my colleague for the question of the dating.
I don't have much to say on dating. Well, thank you very much for your paper. I don't have much to say about dating, and others may disagree, but I'm going to probably stay away from that question and land on a certain date. But whether we say it's post-exilic, exilic, pre-exilic, I'd say it's difficult to say. But what I'm interested in hearing about is thinking about how this speaks about the experience or the ideas of the Exodus according to this psalmist, which may be very different from let's just say what we have in the Torah. So I think this is where, I'd be interested to hear maybe more, from the perspective of this psalmist, what does the Exodus look like? So yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out I've just provided on dating, but I'll leave it to others.
Okay, you used the words cop-out, okay? But is Bill Schneidewin in the audience? Professor Schneidewin, he's my buddy, a biblical scholar from UCLA, and here he comes to the microphone. Please, Bill.
Well, we really should get Richard Elliott Friedman to talk about dating this, right? Well, I mean, I was reading this as he was looking at it, as he was talking about it. There's nothing that's what we would call late biblical Hebrew in Psalm 114. There's nothing that jumps out at me. On the other hand, which would mean that it's theoretically pre-exilic. On the other hand, it is in the third, fourth, fifth books of the Psalter, which are usually thought as being compiled in the post-exilic period. So, I mean, and some of the spelling, which I don't think is a very useful dating technique, is late, but that's probably reflecting the compiling of the book, so of the psalm. So to me, it looks like a pre-exilic psalm, and also the terminology that's used in it looks pre-exilic. But I mostly agree with Richard Elliott Friedman on the dating of the Hebrew Bible, so I tend to see a lot of it as pre-exilic anyway. If there were a good German scholar here, they would undoubtedly date it to the Hasmonean period.
Thank you. Yes, please. Katerina.
There is a late tradition about an earthquake in Exodus, and it's recorded by Artapanus, that is a Jewish historian that wrote in Greek. So it's maybe in Egypt, maybe in 2nd century BCE. And Jerome also, in one of his letters, speaks about this earthquake. It's a tradition. I think we can conclude it. It's a part of the traditions regarding Exodus. And I agree that it's very important, the earthquake, as an element of the theology of the God of Israel. It was a very, I did a study, I presented a paper on this in an Azor meeting, if you remember. It's a very important element in the theology of the God of Israel, and even of the gods of Egypt. Set, the bad brother of Osiris, was the god of earthquakes in Egypt.
Yes, please. So, introduce yourself.
My name's Chris McKinney. I'll give a talk tomorrow. My only question or comment is, why not just interpret the psalm by the narrative that it seems to be reflective of? In other words, when you talk about the river and the sea, why not Yam Suf and the Jordan River, which seems to be nice bookends? And when we talk about fountains out of a rock, why not connect that with the very clear narrative that we have in Exodus and later on in Numbers? Why does it have to be connected to the land of Israel when we have the text itself giving us that, and it's a sort of just a summary of that in poetic form and synonymous parallelism?
I'm not a biblical scholar, but don't the biblical scholars talk about historical memory a lot? I mean, isn't this a big topic of investigation? And Philip, maybe you can speak to that.
Well, this goes back kind of like to the question I had as well, is that I don't know if you have to connect Psalm 114 to what you have in the Torah. I think that we might think, well, it has to presume anything that we have in the Torah, but why couldn't the psalmist have its own traditions or its own sources in what exactly was the far Exodus or wilderness past? So I think my interest here would be in thinking, how does this psalmist construct and conceive of the Exodus based on what you have here in Psalm 114?
So then the interesting thing becomes, is this looks like a psalm that doesn't know the Exodus tradition in a very strong, significant way. It's not reflecting it. Yeah. So that's hard to imagine of a psalmist in the exilic or post-exilic period.
Well, if it's pre-exilic.
But if it's a pre-exilic psalm, then it can reflect the amorphous nature of the Exodus tradition, especially in the early monarchic period or mid-monarchic period.
Yeah.